Wow, good morning, everyone. If only my review had been that good. Thank you, Madeline. I'm delighted that you're all here, and I forewarn you of three things. First, I have a new set of glasses, so I hope I read everything the way I should. Secondly, I'm a lawyer, so forgive me, and Ray, we have to apply this to you as well. And thirdly, I stayed up very late last night watching the U.S. and Mexico duel to a 0-0 tie. So I might be a tad tired, have the wrong glasses, and hopefully I do a good job today for you. So I'm your facilitator for the next 2 days, and I work, as Madeline mentioned, for her as a special assistant to her for innovation and legal affairs. I also act as the administrator for one half of the Entrepreneurship Initiative. We have a training program and a resources center. I administer the resources center side. My colleague, Roger Brown, administers the training program side. It is the oversight person here is Dave Harwell. He is administering the entire program. And we have a wonderful assistant to the entire program, Angela Morris, who's with us today and probably not here because she's out there at the registration desk, I'm sure, trying to make sure everyone is comfortable and getting the information they need. So I really need to give a shout out to them. Without their help, without their leadership, without their hard work, this would not have been possible. All I've done is try to put the program together, and they're making it happen. So I really appreciate all of their legwork. This is a member program. So we invite you to be a member if you're not a member. And I'm going to give a shameless plug for membership. You can become a member very easily by going to the ACS website and reaching through the membership and networking tab. So I invite you to become a member if you're not a member. As I said, this is a membership-based program. The folks that are walking through this program, through the training program and the resources center, are all members. So over the next 2 days, I and this marvelous group of distinguished speakers and presenters sincerely hope that you are able to obtain some practical and useful takeaways from the information they're about to deliver. We tried to make this very practical. We know there are lots of programs that you can get basic information. This is not one of them. We wanted to design this as some real takeaways. Before we get started, I'd also like to join Madeline in thanking our sponsors. The Chemical Heritage Foundation for this wonderful facility, and of course the law firm of Thompson Coburn, with the offices in Chicago, St. Louis, Southern Illinois, and Washington, D.C., and that's my shameless plug, Ray. We lawyers kind of stick together, right? All right, so I'd also like to make sure we acknowledge our colleagues again. Dave Harwell is in the back, and Dave, if you can give a wave. Please, if there are any issues, concerns, Dave is here to help. My colleague Roger Brown. Roger, are you here? He's probably at the... Oh, there he goes. Okay, Roger, thank you. And also Angela, and Angela I think is at the registration desk, so I wanted to make sure we acknowledge their work and their support. A few ground rules, if I may. We're on a very tight program, and we want as much information as possible from the speakers. I am going to look like I am dictating the program. I hope you don't think that. We want to make sure that our timing is very, very good and we get as much information as possible to you. So I took a page, I innovated, and I took a page out of the game last night. And I will show you a yellow card. So if you see this yellow card and you're part of the speakers, the panel of the moderator, and I will be sitting directly to your left, I'd like you to know there's about 5 minutes left so that we can try to keep this very, very smooth. I'd also like to make mention that we would ask that you, as speakers and panelists, to help us to keep the flow going very well. I will be circulating to ask you to join me in the center right that's facing the stage, and this way we'll have a very smooth transition to get you up and keep the program moving. All right, so now with that, I'm done with all those remarks, thank goodness. It is my pleasure to now introduce our first speaker, Dane Stangler. Dane is the Acting Director of Research and Policy at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. I think we all know those folks. Dane leads the Research and Policy Department and serves on the senior leadership team. He also provides research and writing on a variety of subjects, including entrepreneurship and cities. He initiates and manages the Kauffman Foundation Research Series on firm formation and economic growth, and contributes to the blog Growthology. Aren't those blog names just wonderful? Growthology. Dane, well done. He also presents for the foundation by speaking at many meetings and conferences around the country like this. Dane will present his views on this topic entitled, Will America Remain Entrepreneurial? So please join me in welcoming Dane Stangler to the podium. Dane.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Madeline and Tom, for those remarks. Ken's right, it is a great name, Growthology, but unfortunately I cannot take credit for that. If you're like me, you winced when Tom brought up the NCAA tournament, because if you're like me, your bracket has either been destroyed or the teams you're partial to, in my case, Wisconsin and the University of Missouri, are out of it by now. So hopefully you're doing better, but I had to wince when Tom brought that up. I want to thank the Chemical Heritage Foundation and the American Chemical Society for including Kauffman in this program. We work, as many of you know, as some of you might know, to support entrepreneurs, to bring attention to policymakers and others, issues important to entrepreneurs. And so it's just as important for me to be here to talk about what we do as it is for me to listen to you. And I've been allotted 40 or 50 minutes, so I hope a large chunk of that can be Q&A or discussion, because I want to listen to your perspectives and feedback on a lot of the issues around entrepreneurship. I also want to say that at a personal level, it's a real honor for me to be here, because even though I personally have almost zero connection, my professional life to the world of chemistry, my grandfather was an organic chemist, and he actually passed away almost exactly a year ago. He worked at Bell Labs for a number of years, moved to St. Louis to head the chemistry department at what that time was the new University of Missouri St. Louis. His name was Robert W. Murray, or Bob Murray, and so it's a point of personal pride for me to speak here. Unfortunately, I inherited almost none of his chemical accomplishments or inclinations. That's actually fortunate for you, because you don't have to listen to me talk about chemistry. And so I'm going to talk about something I do know a little bit about, but which you also know a lot about, which is entrepreneurship. And as is immediately evident, I think that we are either approaching or in the early stages of an entrepreneurial revolution in this country. In her opening remarks, Madeline mentioned some research that Kauffman has done lately, not only in the importance of new companies and growing companies to job creation, which I think we all intuitively know and recognize, but there's also some other research, both from Kauffman and from other researchers, that job creation from new companies and young companies has actually been falling in the U.S. for a few years, actually predating the recession. So it's not, a recessionary or cyclical phenomenon. And so it's not exactly counterintuitive, but it's contrary to some of the trends we see for me to get up here and say that we're on the cusp of another entrepreneurial revolution or a new entrepreneurial revolution. So I want to take some time talking about the reasons that I think that, or that we at Kauffman think that. And I'm not naive about it either. I think we all know, both at your individual level with your companies and yourselves, but also at a larger social and economic level, there are many challenges and barriers and obstacles to making that happen. Before actually getting into the substance, I hate to assume that everyone knows about Kauffman, so I thought I'd just take a minute or two to talk about where we're coming from so you have some idea of the work we do and sort of the background for this. As Ken mentioned, our donor was Ewing Kauffman. Mr. Kauffman was a very successful entrepreneur in Kansas City. When he returned from World War II service, he became a pharmaceutical salesman in Kansas City. And he was such a prodigious salesman that in his first year, through commissions, he out-earned the president of the company. And so they rewarded him by slashing his territory. And so the next year, he did it again. He out-earned the president of the company. And they again responded by cutting his territory. And so he did what many of you may have done, but lots of other people done in lots of sectors. He said, I'm not going to work for anyone else again. And so he started his own company, a pharmaceutical company, in his basement. And he subsequently grew it into a billion-dollar company, Marion Labs. The remaining pieces of it are now part of Sanofi-Aventis. But it was for many decades a social and economic pillar in Kansas City. And Mr. Kauffman is also famous in Kansas City and in the world of sports for bringing baseball back to Kansas City. He was the owner of the Royals for many years. And toward the end of his life, like many successful American entrepreneurs, he turned his attention to philanthropy and set up this foundation in the late 1980s. Unlike many successful American entrepreneurs, he wanted his philanthropic dollars to go towards supporting and promoting what made him successful, which was the ability to start and grow a company. He called himself a common man who did an uncommon thing, and he wanted to make it a more common pathway, a more common achievement for larger segments of American society. And so we focus on entrepreneurship, and education is roughly the second half, the other half of what the foundation does. Many of you are probably familiar with some of the entrepreneurship programs we run and fund, such as Fast Track. Some of you may have even gone through it. On the education side, we fund a good deal of research and run programs. We actually run our own charter school in Kansas City. And we also conduct a lot of research ourselves, which is sort of the source for my talk. As I said, I think we're either on the cusp of or in the early stages of an entrepreneurial revolution. I think there's three main reasons or main trends driving that. Across wide swaths of the economy, it's become easier to start a company. We have massive technological progress, much of which the people in this room represent. And there's the emergence of what we at Kauffman call this new producer society. The first question that the burden is on me to address I won't claim to be a lawyer, but I have a JD, so the burden's always on me to prove something. This initial question of are we really going to have more entrepreneurs is not actually obvious or intuitive or really apparent in any of the data that we have. I mentioned that some of the more recent data show a decline not only in the number of new businesses, but in the employment contributions of those new businesses. And if you were to simply extrapolate or assume a continuation of the data, it would not be obvious at all that we are going to have more entrepreneurs. An extrapolation would simply be fewer entrepreneurs because surprisingly, we think of ourselves and we consider ourselves a very entrepreneurial society, and we are compared to most countries around the world. But for whatever reason, there's methodological reasons, but there's also very real economic reasons. We've actually had a falling business creation rate in this country for about 25 years, so cyclical and non-cyclical. And it sort of fluctuates annually, but within a very narrow band of variance. And sort of the most recent peak in the mid-2000s was really fueled by the housing bubble to a great degree. And so I feel that it's necessary, to show why we're going to reverse this trend. Not only in business creation, just the number of new businesses, but also in the growth and the contribution in terms of jobs and innovation of those new businesses. The first reason is, I think, and this is where I'd really like to hear from some of you, either now or later in the Q&A, is falling barriers and greater ease of starting a company. Flipping through the Thomson-Coburn slides that Ray's going to present, it's clearly not a simple process. There's clearly a ton of calculations and decisions and paperwork involved. However, both anecdotally, we hear a lot about the falling cost of company creation. We're trying to work on actually putting some numbers behind that, but also just in the sheer availability of starting something and testing ideas and experimenting. There are probably more things on offer today and more things coming online every day than have ever been available to entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs. And there's sort of two dimensions of this. One are new outlets or new platforms to actually start companies or to rapidly test an idea or to experiment with an idea, a product or a service. And the second dimension of this are tech startups, what we would typically think of as the Silicon Valley type companies. Those are some of those listed on the left that are actually creating new platforms and extending the reach, access, and opportunities for what many of us typically think of as sort of traditional small business and lifestyle businesses, mom and pop shops, things like this. And so the falling barriers and the lower costs are not only true for the tech startups that can start online in someone's living room and be global in 3 weeks, but also for large swaths of existing businesses in the economy. And so this is only going to continue. This is probably not something that's going to reverse itself. And so to me, this is the strongest trend for simply expecting higher levels of business creation. And to sort of continue in the vein with Tom of the sports analogy and with Ken, in the soccer game last night, if you have more shots on goal, presumably you have a higher chance, A, of scoring and of scoring more. So a greater denominator through this should lead to higher levels of entrepreneurship. I realize that in the company of scientists and chemists who have not only done outstanding work in research labs but have started companies, it's kind of ironic for me to get up here and tell you how great technology is advancing because you are the ones actually doing it, who are actually living it, who are making it happen. But I think there's an important metaphor here that you are living and doing and that lots of other people in the economy are living and doing. And that's this metaphor of the second half of the chessboard. And some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not. There's a story, it might be an apocryphal story, it probably is, but it doesn't matter because it's a metaphor. There's a story that in ancient India, when the inventor of chess presented his newly invented game to the emperor was so delighted with it that he told the creator that he could name any reward he wanted. He'd give him anything. And what the creator of chess said he wanted 1 grain of rice to double for every square on the chessboard. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, so on. So an exponential growth rate of grains of rice. And by the 32nd square, after the first half of the chessboard is done, whatever the number is, I can't remember, and someone's probably going to get out their phone and do the calculation, but it's still a manageable amount of rice. So these are just the grains of rice. So it's still a highly manageable amount of rice for the emperor to provide him. Obviously, once you get to the end of the chessboard, to the 62nd, 63rd, and 64th square, it's more grains of rice than that will ever exist in the Indian Empire and will ever exist in the history of mankind's, the history of rice farming in human history. And so this is a widely used and frequently used metaphor, especially in sort of techno-utopian circles, but for technological advance in broader society. And there are a lot of indications, maybe in your fields, but definitely in fields such as robotics and new types of manufacturing, that we are sort of entering that second half of the chessboard. That the exponential growth of technology and the exponential impact of that technology is just now about to take off. And you could say this about a lot of things, parts of the economy and research that I don't even know exist, but just to highlight a few, I think we're all familiar with some of the rapidly advancing gains in robotics. This is a picture of Baxter, who's sort of one of the newest robots to come online, has already been being used in lots of assembly lines across the country and across the world. The smartphones that most of us carry, it's now 60% of the population now has a smartphone. They're becoming faster and better every day, and the sensors embedded in them, lots of people, I was never a Star Trek fan, but lots of people think we're very close to the Star Trek tricorder realization, where we can have these sensors on us all the time, and they're going to measure everything. And you can already buy wristbands and leg bands to do this. And so sensors are accelerating in their power and their utility. Biotech, we've invested tons and tons of resources in basic research in biotech and in chemistry and other areas. And we are definitely, there's lots of complaints that we haven't reaped those benefits, but obviously those payoffs take a long time. And I think we're definitely on the cusp of reaping a lot of those benefits from those advances from that investment in basic research. Probably my favorite example of sort of technological progress and advancing toward the second half of the chessboard is in autonomous vehicles or self-driving cars. A couple of years ago, I was sort of imagining, when my kids start to drive and what it might look like. I thought, there probably will be a greater preponderance of electric vehicles or natural gas vehicles or whatever, lithium-ion vehicles when they turn 16. I actually think I was very wrong now. I think that by the time they drive, or in 10 or 20 years, self-driving cars will, if not be the dominant mode of transportation, will definitely be on the way to being the dominant mode of transportation. And this is good for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is an anticipated decline in fatal car accidents, but things like less traffic congestion. And along with self-driving cars, there's companies now doing smart pavement, where the pavement has embedded microchips and not only tells you when the amount of wear and tear on the pavement, so what needs to be replaced, but then the pavement can actually talk to the cars. So now you're going to have self-driving cars talking to each other and talking to the pavement, and the disruptive impacts of this, both positive but also negative, are simply going to be massive. And we're probably a lot closer to that day than I think we either realize or that we're ready for. The third major trend that we see as driving an increase in entrepreneurship and innovation in the US and elsewhere is sort of the emergence of what we call this new producer society. As many of you know, there's been a lot of attention devoted to manufacturing lately in the US, both the loss of manufacturing jobs and innovation over the last 20 or 30 years, but also in the last few years, hope and some reality of a return of manufacturing jobs as labor cost shifts, as shipping cost shifts, as wages in China go up, and as the price of oil remains at high levels. It makes sense. And there's a lot of companies, actually, they go by various names: reshoring, insourcing, repatriating manufacturing jobs to the U.S. That's getting a lot of attention, and the White House and other people in Washington are placing a lot of hope on that. That, I think, is actually a less important, or will be a less important development than this new producer society, which is driven by smaller scale technologies, but that enable a greater and faster rate of scale and growth. And so I'm thinking principally of digital manufacturing, 3D printing, and a variety of things that go broadly under what's called the maker movement. And a lot of people, I've adopted this sort of schema, or this evolutionary schema, from Peter Marsh, who wrote a wonderful book, New Industrial Revolution, that I highly recommend. But lots of people are using sort of a similar timeline for manufacturing. So as you sort of think about, a broad history of manufacturing in the U.S., we had sort of craftsmen or artisanal manufacturing in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then in the second half, Samuel Colt and weapons manufacturers really pioneered the first interchangeability and crude proto-assembly lines. And following directly from Colt and bicycle manufacturers were automobile manufacturers. Henry Ford sort of being the most famous example of massive, Model T assembly line standardized production. And that really prevailed for a large chunk of the 20th century. And then Toyota came along with lean production. And lean production has now spread to many, many different parts of manufacturing, Toyota being obviously the most well-known example. And you started to get a lot more capacity for personalization or customization with lean production while still maintaining high volumes. I think a number I read was that Toyota is able to produce, within its set stable of cars and models, something like 1.8 million different variants of those cars. So we're very much in that stage, but we're rapidly moving with digital manufacturing, 3D printing, smaller scale type stuff into sort of mass personalization or mass customization. And 3D printing is quickly moving from sort of a hobbyist kind of thing into remaking large chunks of American industry. And we're actually going to see a manufacturing renaissance driven not by reshoring or insourcing, but by these smaller scale but higher impact technologies. I said at the beginning that I wasn't being naive about it. I was trying not to be sort of starry-eyed about this, and probably everyone has already thought of exceptions or challenges or what about this to everything I've just said. And you're right, there's a lot of barriers to actually getting there or to seeing this entrepreneurial revolution actually come to pass. I just want to talk about three. I don't mean to suggest that these are the only three. These are just the three that I think are easy to grasp right now and hopefully can be addressed over the next 10 or 20 years. And those are demographic trends, the relationship between innovation and jobs, and our educational system. We probably all hear the gloom and doom about an aging population, and this is sort of what serves as the backdrop for the budget. I can't even call it a budget debate in Washington, seriously. The budget circus in Washington. This is sort of what's behind it, right? Is the worries about entitlement spending, that Medicare and Social Security are going to bankrupt us because we have an aging population, and they're going to, with higher costs, but also because then we have fewer workers per relative to people over the age of 65 or 75. And this is obviously a very real phenomenon, and the U.S. does not face it as acutely as other countries. Europe, Japan, and China face it much more acutely than the U.S. China actually saw its working age population shrink by 3.5 million people last year alone, and they're about to age much faster than almost any other country in history, really. But the U.S. has clearly, we reaped a big demographic dividend in the 20th century, and we're clearly past that. We're not having as many children, we have an aging population, and this is sort of painted as a universally bad thing. The country's not going to survive, we can't produce enough, we can't support everyone. I don't want to discount those concerns, but I think that there are silver linings in there with the aging trends, and I actually think that an entrepreneurial revolution or an increase in entrepreneurship is going to happen because of those demographic trends, not in spite of. One of those is when you overlay demographic trends with labor force participation rates, you see, not surprisingly I think, but it's kind of surprising to see the actual numbers, an increase in labor force participation rate among people over 60. And that's been going on for about 20 years. Now that's a good news, bad news kind of thing, because lots of people will immediately say, well, the recession eviscerated people's nest eggs. There have been changes to private pensions, corporate pensions, public pensions that have sort of extended the incentives to work longer, and we're forcing people to work when they otherwise wouldn't. Undoubtedly, some of that underlies this. It's also true, however, that we are living healthier longer, so you can extend your working life by a lot longer, and happily, rates of entrepreneurial activity, of business creation among people over 50 and over 60 are actually much higher than most other age groups, the one exception being people in their 30s and 40s, which I'll talk about in a minute. Usually when I talk about entrepreneurship among people in their 50s and 60s, the immediate response from people is, well, those don't count. Those aren't real companies. It's people starting side businesses just to support themselves, or they're consulting businesses that don't count. I have no idea to what extent that's true. This is a limitation of the data in our measurement. It's probably in there somewhere. But this is sort of we complain about an aging population, but then a lot of people who talk about it have sort of this bias in that they discount the economic activity of people who start businesses in their 50s and 60s. If you look at only technology and engineering companies founded in the US over the last 15 years, there were more founders over 50 than there were under 30. So this sort of stereotypical image we have of every tech entrepreneur as a Mark Zuckerberg or a Bill Gates in the 1970s is, I don't want to say wrong, but it's less than accurate. And we're going to have more of that as we have more people entering their 50s and 60s, and more of those people are going to be starting companies. And so simultaneously, we're going to have more entrepreneurs in their 50s and 60s starting companies that matter. At the same time, as we have more people over the next 20 or 30 years entering their 30s and 40s, which turn out to be sort of what I call like the peak age for entrepreneurship. That's when you're most likely to start a company, is in your 30s and 40s. And this happens because we do have, even though we have an aging population, we have a growing population. In 2007, there were more babies born than any other year in U.S. history, including the peak year of the baby boom in 1957. We have a lower fertility rate, but because of a larger population, we're having more kids. And so the sheer volume of our population, not only the young, but also entering those older ages, combined with increasing labor force participation, high rates of entrepreneurship, and living healthier longer, these demographic trends are actually going to hopefully, and I think probably, turn out to be an economic boon rather than sort of the disaster scenario that's painted or that lurks behind the budget scene in Washington and elsewhere. So there's a silver lining to the demographic trend. It's harder to find a silver lining to the discussion or the debate about technological innovation and jobs. This is a very real concern, and it's becoming more acute because of the financial crisis, recession, and recovery. And you don't need me to tell you this, most likely. There are lots of concerns over sort of American decline and economic stagnation. My father just finished reading that book, Time to Start Thinking, and he said a more appropriate title should be Time to Start Drinking, because it is so pessimistic, page after page. These are very real concerns, and they're concerns that predate the recession. If you think about the loss of manufacturing jobs, but then we talk about advances in robotics, that same robot, Baxter, is going to put a lot of people out of work, and already has. And this is just going to compound the difficulties that have plagued the average American worker over the last few decades. And again, these stories and these statistics are pretty common in the media and in articles, and so you don't need me to harp on about them. But just in terms of income, in terms of keeping up with the rest of the economy, and also in terms of income inequality, the average American worker hasn't exactly been faring great over the last 20 or 30 years. And I know there's lots of caveats about methodology and how you count and what you don't count, but these trends are real, and they've only gotten worse in the recession. The chart I didn't put up is comparing the present business cycle, which that chart shows, to the average of all other post-World War II recessions. And if you look at the average of all other recoveries, all those lines go up and to the right. They're all increasing. And so we've completely broken that pattern in this recession, and this just compounds the sort of pre-recession trends in how American workers are faring. And this is a real challenge, not only for policy, but also for the economy. I think that there are some reasons for cautious optimism, although I'm less optimistic about this than about the results of demographic trends. There are lots of people out there saying, things are getting a lot better, manufacturing's coming back. We talked about reshoring. Chinese labor costs are going way up, so there's a lot of hope that we're going to bring back manufacturing jobs. A lot of people invest hope in what a person at a think tank in Washington calls the app economy, which is exactly what it sounds like, people building apps for smartphones. He estimates that it's created about 500,000 jobs. I'm not one to dispute his methodology. Lots of people do, but it's sort of a symbol of the hope that people are investing in new technologies. Obviously, someone who gets laid off from a textile factory is not going to go back and build apps. There might be a few exceptions, but that's probably not going to be the general storyline. And so how we retrain people or better prepare people to start off with when they're at younger ages, and how we transition them to a different type of economy is really what underlies the third major concern, which is by far the biggest to me, and that is our educational system. I'd be really interested to hear, especially for those of you who are in universities or still have university ties, your perspective on this, because we hear there's varying sorts of stories. Things are great, things are terrible, we can't find what we need, we have a talent shortage, we don't have a talent shortage. So be really interested in your feedback, both as employers, but also as people close to students. We all are probably familiar with the not great stats on the US as compared to other countries. You could take any international test and the numbers look basically the same. Again, there's lots of caveats here about the methodology. Is it really appropriate to compare Shanghai, which is the top school district in China, to the entire US? Probably not. But even within the US, if you were just making national comparisons, we have massive disparities in school districts and school performance in this country. We're very top elite, and then we sort of have everyone else. And again, interesting to hear your perspectives on, do we have a shortage of talent? Are you finding it difficult to hire people? Same sort of concerns in higher ed, as you're all familiar with. Debates over students are learning, students are not learning, we're teaching them the wrong things, they're not teaching them anything. And of course, the ever-present concerns about the rising cost of higher ed, and then what are we actually paying for? Are we getting our money's worth, whatever that means in relation to higher ed? So there's lots of concerns, to more or less lesser degrees in terms of validity about the entire spectrum of American education. Despite all the problems, there do seem to be some glimmers of hope and reasons for optimism. One of those is, for the first time in 30, 35 years, we've actually made progress in graduating kids from high school. We made massive gains throughout the entire 20th century, and then it was stuck from 1975 on. It actually kind of fell after 1975. And as you can see from this chart, for the first time, we've actually now surpassed that 1975 level. There's a debate, not surprisingly, about the reasons for this. Is it educational reform? Is it not educational reform? Is it the administration's policies? Is it not? But clearly, something is going right. And actually, the numbers look even better for minorities. Minority graduation rates have increased further than the overall graduation rate, which is very good news. As a lot of you may know, there's more and more programs on offer for students, especially K-12 students, to get engaged in science and technology and engineering and math, the so-called STEM subjects. FIRST Robotics is something that we are highly enthusiastic about, and it definitely engages kids as a sport, as a competition, and the presumption is that more of those kids who participate in FIRST will enter the STEM workforce. It's going to take a long time to see if that bears out. But this is important. I don't have to tell you, but I have to tell other audiences. This is very important because people with STEM degrees have a much higher propensity to start companies, to be entrepreneurs. As you can see, I assume those are readable, but for companies founded between 1995 and 2006, which this chart refers to, 47% of the founders had STEM degrees. That's obviously a much higher proportion than people getting overall STEM degrees in the general population. The numbers are even more skewed for immigrant entrepreneurs. 75% of immigrant entrepreneurs who founded tech and engineering companies had STEM degrees. Most of them earned from US universities, and that sort of underscores the importance of immigration, which is a topic we can take up in the discussion if you like. So those are good sources of hope in terms of K through 12 education. There's also massive ferment in higher ed. Lots of people trying to sort of bust open the doors of the traditional university and sort of assault the ramparts, right, of the traditional four-year school. And there's lots of experiments going on, not only for your traditional 18 to 22-year-old college student, but also for adult and people who are part-time students. That the traditional college student, 18 to 22, residential student, is now a tiny shouldn't say tiny, is now a not large minority of higher ed enrollment. It's like 25%, I think, of higher ed enrollment is that traditional college student. So there's lots of people trying to think of new models to serve that other 75% because they're not well served by that sort of 4-year residential model. Some of you may be familiar with MOOCs, the massive online open courses that are getting so much attention, negative and positive attention in universities. I put a question mark there because I haven't made up my mind yet about the impact of MOOCs. Clearly, there are massive freshman courses that could be done and probably should be done online more cheaply and more easily. It's also true, just taking the field of chemistry, you can't do a lab online. And so there's lots of things that won't be moved into the MOOCs. And to the extent that any of you have a perspective or experience with sort of online course experimentation at universities, I'd be really interested to hear your feedback and your perspective on that. The problem, I think, is that a lot of this reform and experimentation in K-12 and higher ed is sort of taking place around the edges. And it's not yet oriented to or achieving what we need to have achieved. And that, in my view, is we need more people who are able to do recombination, which is really the essential source of innovation, of creativity, and of entrepreneurship. One of my friends, Professor George Mason, talks about this in terms of Legos, and that we've invested lots and lots of resources and people in creating more Lego bricks, more fundamental building blocks, whether it's basic research or skills or whatever. What we don't have enough of is people who can actually combine and recombine those Lego bricks. And I thought that was a really useful analogy because my kids like to play with Legos. And, if your kids are like mine, they don't often go back and build the original thing that we purchased that's on the cover of the box or in the manual. It happens very infrequently because it breaks, we lose pieces, and so you can't rebuild it. So what we do instead, or what they do instead, is they build completely new things. They invent stuff. And we need more, I'm not saying we need more people like my kids, we need more people who can combine and recombine those fundamental blocks, those Lego bricks, in new things without manuals, without instructions. And that, to me, so far, is kind of the missing ingredient in a lot of this experimentation and reform that is taking place in education, in higher ed and in K through 12. And the good news about this is that we've actually done this before. We've invented a completely new educational institution to respond to a completely new or rapidly transforming economy, and that was the high school. Throughout the entire 19th century, a very tiny percentage of American children even went to anything past elementary school because most of the population worked on farms, and so you didn't need to go to school. For those kids who did go to school, which mostly in the cities, there were a few high schools, but they were just a non-important part of the educational landscape. These private academies were much more important and enrolled a higher percentage of kids than high schools did. It was only in the late 19th century, and then especially in the early 20th century, that some communities, namely parents and community leaders in very, at that time, out-of-the-way places, Iowa and Oregon were really at the forefront of this. They saw that their kids were not being prepared at all adequately for the new industrial economy, which was at that time just coming into being. So, as many of you know, there were massive advances in chemistry, new types of manufacturing. The manufacturing of steel was completely redone by advances in chemistry. The manufacture of the automobile. And so there was this was the second industrial revolution. And what was needed were new kinds of blue-collar workers, higher skilled blue-collar workers. The people who worked in the weapons manufacturing and bicycle manufacturing could not work in the new factories. You also needed people to fill the white-collar jobs, which had never existed before. This is a completely new and expanding source of employment. And so the high school was massively expanded. It was completely adapted and reinvented for the purposes of training people to meet the needs of the new economy. And if there was ever a grassroots movement in American history, this was it. It was completely done by parents and communities, starting in Iowa and Oregon and all throughout the West and Midwest. And as this chart shows, this was a huge tailwind for the U.S. economy through the entire 20th century. There's no way to underestimate the benefits or to overestimate the benefits of the high school movement. This was followed, of course, by the mass democratization of post-secondary ed, which in the 60s and 70s, and we sort of we're still reaping the benefits of that. But it was really the high school movement that laid the groundwork for what people call the American century. And so that, to me, is a central lesson in that we've done this before. We invented and adapted a completely new institution for economic change, and we can do it again, and we're trying to do it again. But I think there's hope for a lot of those educational reform because we were somehow able to do it before. So, just to recap, I think that there's lots of sources for hope, despite what a lot of the data say in terms of business creation and job creation. And there's lots of caveats about how we measure and how we count new businesses. We do seem to be on the cusp of on the early stages of something very different. And I know it's very dangerous to say this time is different, but it actually does appear as if this time is different. Certainly in terms of how the economy is recovering is very different. We're not recovering at the same pace that we have in all prior recessions, at least going back to World War II. At the same time, you see sort of glimmers of and real instances of a very different economic structure taking place. And the challenge is going to be transitioning ourselves and transitioning, especially kids in school right now, K through 12 and higher ed, to not only be entrepreneurs, which I obviously and you obviously think is important, but also just to participate in that new kind of entrepreneurial economy. So I'd be very interested to hear, depending on how much time I have, your feedback and perspectives from your own experience as entrepreneurs and sort of where you think things are going. So thank you. Yeah, I think so.
We have time for questions. Is that working? There we go. We have time for questions.
I'm Mukund Chorghare. I have a quick comment about your story on the chess. So there is a sequel to that one. The king was kind of worried about how he can live up to his promises. The lawyer then examined the contract and said, there is nothing in it that says we cannot tell the man to count his own rice grains one at a time. So that is the first time in history that a lawyer has saved his boss, but also killed a money-generating idea. So
I didn't know that part. That's a good thing.
That was not my question, though. A lot of the VCs and other people and all people who fund innovative ideas automatically make the assumption, it seems, that any new technology is automatically going to kill jobs. I'm not sure that that's a defensible claim because, for example, we used to ride buggies. Then when Henry Ford invented the cars, it did create a lot of jobs, from research to people who serviced all the cars and all. What's your feeling on that?
Thank you, Mukund.
I agree with you, and you're right. Most major economic transitions in the U.S. and elsewhere, we haven't had massive unemployment because of technology. 100 years ago, whatever it was, 80% of the population worked in agriculture. Today, 2 or 3% does, and we did not have massive unemployment. Part of the reason we did not is because other parts of the economy adapted. The high school was able to transition lots of people from agricultural work to, at that time, industrial work. So you're right, but there are lots of people who think that this time is different, that the recession is not just a cyclical thing with, we're lagging in unemployment, but we are going to have massive unemployment. I agree with you that history teaches and that these other possibilities will not lead to that, but there's a lot of smart people who do subscribe to that, and so we need to figure out ways to transition our institutions, but also create the new institutions to make sure that doesn't happen.
Another question here.
Sadiq Shah, University of Texas, Pan American. First of all, I want to thank you for your very intriguing presentation. You stimulated thoughts on some critical aspects of it. Number one, you made a comment that a lot of the manufacturing is coming back. And if you want to see live that manufacturing coming back to the U.S., you want to visit South Texas, give me a call and I'll give you a tour. Sure. Because all of the manufacturing is coming back to the border, because that has some significant implications for the entire U.S. economy. Mm-hmm. Our population is growing so fast that every month a new elementary school is launched. The population growth is just amazing. The University of Texas system is investing so much money into the educational system that it is launching a new medical school. It is merging 2 universities with us, several research institutes under our umbrella, and that is going to create, you may have seen, you are from St. Louis, the gateway to the west. There is a new gateway to the north and the south emerging, and that is at the border of Mexico and Texas. So I would strongly encourage Kauffman Foundation to take a look at that border region, because a lot is happening there. Another comment, and I think that's an intriguing comment, that the cost of education is going. And I wouldn't be surprised that someday, and we're talking about primarily the cost of education in publicly, traditionally we call it publicly supported institutions, but they're really not today. Right. They're publicly assisted, even if you can say that. The reason the cost is going up because there's less and less support from the state system. And I wouldn't be surprised that in 50 years that we need to invent a new concept in higher education, and that is the assisted universities may disappear and they may become private. And the state of Virginia has already launched 2 examples of that. And because the cost is going to then come to about the same level as private institutions as the state funding disappears. And the states obviously want them to be more self-sufficient. Now that also creates an opportunity for us to be thinking about what is going to be the new model for public universities. And I don't have any answers for it. As a nation, we have to debate and figure out different models to see what will work the best in 50 and 100 years from now. Talking about manufacturing, you know, we still talk about manufacturing. Is it possible, it is conceivable that in 20 years from now, there may be a totally different concept than manufacturing as we know it today? As you pointed out, the example of 3D printing, there may be a totally different kind of model whereby corporations are not doing mass production. You and I are producing the product. It is customized to the level. We do it in our own garage or on the kitchen table. So just wanted to make some of those comments just to stimulate the conversation further. Thank you for your nice presentation.
No, I obviously
Absolutely.
I obviously think you're exactly right on the 3D printing and the bringing down the scale of manufacturing. I completely agree with that. Moving into an era, you know, where you and I can do it, and then we send, you know, the prototype elsewhere for someone to build more of it. That's a really good point on higher ed. I don't know what the numbers are for Texas, but you mentioned Virginia, like the University of Virginia and University of Colorado system. They're now in the single digits for state support. You know, it's less than 10%. I don't know what the numbers are for Texas. And you're right that we're already starting to see sort of, I don't know if you'd call them public-private hybrids, but use your term, publicly assisted. It's probably still too early to know how effective it's going to be, but there's this entity, you know, Western Governors University, which is now in like 22 states. And so it has the public imprimatur. And the state, the assistance differs by the level of state, but it does have at least the public imprimatur and some assistance for the student. And the model for Western Governors, and again, still too early to tell on the effectiveness, but it's a competence-based model. So if you enroll in a chemistry class, if you already know chemistry, you can just take a test and demonstrate your competence into it and then move on to your appropriate level rather than sitting through the entire thing of what you already know. So we are starting to see those, and that's also sort of an online, in-person hybrid. I think you're right. There's going to be, 20 years from now, we'll see a much different model. And then your first comment not only is important in terms of manufacturing education, but also for immigration, because those kinds of developments will be really gummed up and hindered if we can't get immigration policy right. And too much of the debate focuses on high-skilled immigrants. And we do a lot of research on that too, but it's also important to keep in mind everyone else who sort of gets lost in that debate. So I think your point sort of raises, underscores the importance of that.
Okay, time for more.
Thank you. Victor McCrary, Morgan State University. You had two slides that were very inspiring, and they inspired this one question. One was the Lego slide, where you have the Legos and say, we have to do more about how do we put these things together in new and novel ways. And then the slide that showed kind of the growth of high schools that time, which was a golden age during America. But during that time in the high schools, a lot of the curriculum was not only the formal book knowledge, but there was also vocational studies, right. Electronics, wood shop, automobiles. A lot of that helped people get into the workforce, but also what it did was stimulate people to create. People could go into these shops afterward, they could work with a piece of wood, do electronics. When I grew up, we did things like crystal radios, so you can know how old I am, that kind of stuff. There is a lot right now being discussed among companies and even in universities that this creativity that you talked about in the slide with the Legos is lacking because we have stripped that vocational curriculum out of the high schools. And so therefore, while our students are going on to college and getting formal book knowledge in chemistry and physics, electrical engineering, and in some cases those labs are limited, they've had limited ability or exposure to that handiness, which allows you to create. And so there are people saying, how do we get that back? Kind of like the German model right now, where they have the apprenticeships. So I'd just like to comment on that.
No, you are exactly right. I'll tell my wife that you found the Lego pictures inspiring, because she usually complains about the mess that the boys and I make with Legos on the floor, so I'll tell her. Yeah, vocational, tech schools have almost disappeared. There's almost a handful. There's only, I think, a handful of them left. You are starting to see some more places experiment with apprenticeships. So the apprenticeship seems to be making a comeback exactly to replace that void. But again, so far just sort of fringe experiments, nothing sort of penetrating very deeply. But your comments about you don't see that creativity in students is certainly borne out, at least in just talking with people from university. I was talking with an electrical engineering professor and entrepreneur at MIT not long ago who said his engineering classes, the initial ones, they don't express the same interest in, he's like, don't you guys want to make something, just want to create something? He says the response just isn't there. So again, those are just anecdotes, but it'd be interesting to hear other people's perspectives, but I think you're right. And so there are some experiments. There's a place called Tech Shop, which started out in Silicon Valley, is now expanded to several other locations. It's basically like a gym model. You pay a subscription fee, and then you get access to plasma machines and 3D printers and everything. It would be nice if a tech shop-like place existed in every single university. There are also more, there's a lot of attention now given to entrepreneurship accelerators, sort of these incubators on steroids. Most of those focus on software, but there are actually a couple that focus on hardware, on actually making stuff. I think it's a place called Lemnos Labs in San Francisco is starting to do that. But again, these are just pockets, and so how we penetrate that broader market is a much bigger question, but I think you're exactly right.
Dane, we have a follow-up question, and then I think we have a number of other questions, so I'm going to see if it's okay with the audience that we work right through the break and let your questions get asked. Feel free to get up and gather some more refreshment if you wish, but you're getting a lot of questions, so we're going to go right through to as long as we can.
Melinda Toomey, Jayhawk Biotech, a spin out of KU. How are you familiar with the Common Core that's being implemented in the K through 12 in all the states? Okay, I really think that deeper, more solid knowledge are those building blocks that we're looking for, and I think that's gonna. I know it's gonna change K through 12 education and give kids that Lego building block type of educational background, and I just wondered if you had any comments on that. And also, I know that in Arkansas, Tennessee, and in Kansas, there are VOTEC schools being built. In Lawrence, we're going to vote next week on building a $30 million new VOTEC building and program. And so if you have any comments on the new VOTEC that's being implemented, that'd be nice to hear.
That's obviously a very promising development. I guess the one constraint we'll be facing there are just state budgets, and private funding will be able to do that for every state or every community. I hope you're right. I really hope you're right about the Common Core. I think there's probably more sources or reasons for hope there than with sort of the testing regime that we're sort of now coming out of under No Child Left Behind. Even within the Common Core, and I'm not an education expert, I know there's still some leeway for states to do it. So we're going to enter this nice natural experiment where Kansas, which has had lots of education debates for which we've become infamous for, will Kansas have the same leg up with the Common Core as Colorado or as Iowa or whatever? So I really hope you're right. And we're actually trying to put in some place in research in Kansas City and elsewhere to actually track that. So I really hope you're right.
So I'm getting reminded that a few people need to maybe use the restroom. How about time for one more question? Sure. Then Dane, please he'll be available, I'm sure, to answer any other questions you have. One more, please.
Hi, my name is Robert DeVita. I'm a medicinal chemistry consultant. And you touched a little bit on how innovation and technology is causing job loss, but then innovation technology will create jobs through creative destruction. So in my industry, the pharmaceutical industry, I don't think we've quite gotten there. Not that I want to see big pharma disappear, but I think the regulatory environment really influences that. So I'm wondering if you could comment on creative destruction, how regulatory environment can hinder or help that, because I don't think you really touched on regulatory environment, which really is a great barrier to innovation.
You're right, and no, I didn't talk about it, and regulation is one of those things that unfortunately gets just immediately caught in sort of partisan battles because people assume either regulation's A, all good, or B, all bad. And the truth is regulation can really be a tool for keeping entry open, right, for entrepreneurship. If done correctly, it can actually be a tool for promoting innovation. But in too many sectors, pharmaceuticals probably being the leading one. I think telecommunications would be a close second. We have massive barriers. Kansas City right now is going through an experiment where Google announced that it's going to build Google Fiber in Kansas City. And this is 1 gigabit per second speed. And the local companies, Time Warner being one of them, are fighting this tooth and nail. And Time Warner's actually, their new advertising campaign is, you don't need speeds that fast. This is ridiculous. You don't need anything that fast, which is an interesting sort of defense of the status quo. So you're right. Pharmaceuticals, telecom, a large swaths of healthcare and medicine, there's massive regulatory barriers. And we're doing a little bit of work with some think tanks in Washington on trying to think about regulatory innovation or smart regulation, however you want to describe it. But yeah, it's a real challenge. The falling barriers to entry clearly haven't penetrated lots of fields. And I don't even know where to begin with pharmaceuticals. I mean, you probably have a much better idea, or with telecoms. But you're right. There's lots of other barriers, regulation being a big one. And the understanding in Washington and state capitals of these industries needs to be further developed, I'd say.
All right. Thank you, Dane, for a very stimulating presentation and a lot of thought-provoking questions. Let's join me, please, in thanking him.